At 4:17 this afternoon, Federal Reserve Chairman Mark Carney issued a statement that has never been issued by a central bank chair in American history. Quote, "The Federal Reserve will not cooperate with any executive tariff policy that undermines monetary stability. If tariffs proceed as announced, the Fed will implement countermeasures, including interest rate adjustments, that will neutralize inflationary impact regardless of administration preferences." 17 minutes later, at 4:34 p.m., the White House announced that President Trump is postponing the implementation of 45% tariffs on Chinese goods originally scheduled for Monday. The postponement is indefinite. The administration stated it will review the policy, but the reality is simple. The Fed chair threatened the president with monetary warfare, and the president backed down. Subscribe to this channel immediately, because what I am about to walk you through is not a policy disagreement between branches. This is the Federal Reserve exercising institutional power against the presidency in a way that has not happened since 1951, when President Truman tried to control the Fed during the Korean War. This is the central bank saying it will sabotage presidential economic policy if that policy threatens price stability. And this is the president discovering that the Fed chair has more power over the economy than he does. Turn on notifications, set them to all, because the institutional crisis that began when Trump announced 45% tariffs on February 28th has escalated into a direct confrontation between executive authority and central bank independence. And the Fed just won. Here's what happened during the 72 hours between the tariff announcement and the Fed chair's ultimatum, because the timeline reveals how the standoff developed. At 8:23 a.m. on February 28th, President Trump posted on social media announcing 45% tariffs on all Chinese imports effective March 10th. The announcement came without warning, no cabinet discussion, no consultation with Treasury or Commerce. The president stated the tariffs would reduce the trade deficit and bring manufacturing jobs back to America. At 9:47 a.m., markets opened. The Dow Jones dropped 1,147 points in the first hour. The S&P fell 6.3%. Bond yields spiked. Investors were pricing in immediate inflation and slower growth. At 11:34 a.m., Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent held an emergency press conference. He stated the administration believes tariffs will strengthen the economy long term, but acknowledged short-term disruption. He was asked if he advised the president on the policy. He stated he learned of the decision when the president posted it. At 2:15 p.m., Federal Reserve Chairman Mark Carney was scheduled to testify before the Senate Banking Committee. Senator Elizabeth Warren asked Carney directly, "Will the Fed raise interest rates to counteract tariff-driven inflation?" Carney responded, "The Federal Reserve's mandate is price stability. If tariffs increase prices, we will respond with appropriate monetary policy." That was the warning shot. Carney was telling the president that if tariffs cause inflation, the Fed will raise rates, which will slow the economy, which will eliminate any benefit the tariffs were supposed to create. At 4:47 p.m., President Trump responded on social media. Quote, "The Fed should be supporting American workers, not threatening to sabotage my policies. If Carney raises rates, he is working against the American people." That was a mistake. Threatening the Fed chair publicly gives the Fed political cover to act aggressively. It transforms the dispute from policy disagreement into institutional independence crisis. Hit that like button right now if you understand what just happened. The president just threatened the Fed chair for doing his job. The algorithm decides what breaks through. You decide whether this analysis reaches people who need to see it, because what I am showing you is the moment the Federal Reserve decided it would not allow presidential trade policy to dictate monetary policy. At 8:34 a.m. on March 1st, the Fed chair's office released internal analysis showing that 45% tariffs would increase consumer prices by 3.2% within 6 months. The analysis stated that to prevent inflation from embedding in expectations, the Fed would need to raise the federal funds rate by at least 150 basis points, possibly 200. That would mean mortgage rates rising to 8%, credit card rates above 22%, and borrowing costs that would choke off business investment. At 10:15 a.m., the White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow was interviewed on CNBC. He stated the Fed's analysis was exaggerated and politically motivated. He said the president expects the Fed to prioritize growth over inflation concerns. At 1:47 p.m., all 12 Federal Reserve regional bank presidents issued a joint statement. This has never happened before. The statement read, "The Federal Reserve System operates independently to fulfill its congressional mandate of price stability and maximum employment. Monetary policy decisions are based on economic data, not political considerations. We support Chairman Carney's approach." That was 12 regional Fed presidents telling the White House that if it attacks Carney, it is attacking the entire institution. At 3:34 p.m., Senator Sherrod Brown, chair of the Senate Banking Committee, announced he would hold emergency hearings on Fed independence if the administration continues pressuring the central bank. He stated, "The Fed must be free from political interference." At 6:23 p.m., former Fed Chair Janet Yellen gave a speech at the Brookings Institution. She stated, "Central bank independence is the foundation of modern economic policy. If presidents can dictate monetary policy, inflation becomes uncontrollable." By midnight on March 1st, the battle lines were drawn. The president wanted tariffs without monetary tightening. The Fed was prepared to raise rates aggressively to offset tariff inflation. And the financial markets were waiting to see who would blink first. At 7:47 a.m. on March 2nd, bond markets opened with 10-year Treasury yields jumping 23 basis points. Investors were betting the Fed would raise rates. Mortgage applications dropped 34% week over week. Corporate bond issuance froze. At 9:15 a.m., President Trump posted again, quote, "If the Fed raises rates, it will cause a recession. I will hold Carney personally responsible. Carney should resign." That was the president calling for the Fed chair to resign for doing his job. At 10:34 a.m., Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer responded, quote, "The president cannot remove the Fed chair except for cause. Disagreeing with tariff policy is not cause. If Trump attempts to fire Carney, the Senate will not confirm a replacement." At 11:47 a.m., legal analysts began discussing whether the president has authority to remove a Fed chair. The Federal Reserve Act states that governors serve 14-year terms and can only be removed for cause. Legal scholars agree that policy disagreement does not constitute cause. But no court has ever ruled on this because no president has ever tried. At 1:15 p.m., the White House held a press briefing. The press secretary was asked if the president would attempt to remove Carney. She stated, "The president has many tools available. We are reviewing all options." At 2:47 p.m., the Fed chair's office announced that Carney would deliver a speech on Monday addressing Fed independence and monetary policy. That speech became the moment everyone was waiting for. At 4:17 p.m. today, March 3rd, Chairman Carney released his statement 3 days early. He did not wait for Monday. He issued the ultimatum immediately. Quote, "The Federal Reserve will not cooperate with any executive tariff policy that undermines monetary stability. If tariffs proceed as announced, the Fed will implement countermeasures, including interest rate adjustments that will neutralize inflationary impact regardless of administration preferences." That is the Fed chair saying, if you implement tariffs, I will crash the economy to stop inflation. You have no choice but to back down. At 4:34 p.m., 17 minutes later, the White House announced the tariff postponement. Drop a comment right now. Tell me if you think the Fed has the authority to threaten the president this way. I am reading every response because this question determines who actually controls economic policy in America. Here are the 6 indicators we are watching to determine whether this crisis resolves or escalates. Indicator 1, does Trump attempt to fire Carney despite legal uncertainty? If he tries and fails, the Fed's power is confirmed. If he tries and succeeds, constitutional crisis deepens. Indicator 2, does the Senate confirm Fed independence through legislation? If Congress passes a bill explicitly protecting Fed chairs from removal except for criminal cause, it eliminates presidential leverage permanently. Indicator 3, do financial markets stabilize or continue pricing in conflict? If markets believe the standoff is over, bond yields will fall and credit will loosen. If markets expect ongoing tension, borrowing costs stay elevated. Indicator 4, do any Fed governors resign in protest of Carney's confrontation? If governors believe Carney overstepped, it weakens the Fed's position. If they remain united, the Fed's institutional power holds. Indicator 5, does Trump implement modified tariffs that avoid triggering Fed response? If he announces smaller tariffs phased in gradually, it allows him to claim victory while avoiding monetary tightening. Indicator 6, do other central banks comment on Fed independence? If the ECB, Bank of Japan, or Bank of England issue statements supporting Carney, it creates international pressure on Trump to back down permanently. Subscribe right now, because what I am about to show you is the 3 scenarios for how this institutional conflict resolves. Scenario 1, Trump accepts Fed supremacy on inflation. The tariff policy is abandoned or modified to levels the Fed considers non-inflationary. Trump focuses on other policies. Carney serves out his term. The precedent is established that the Fed can veto presidential economic policies that threaten price stability. This is the institutional equilibrium scenario. Scenario 2, Trump attempts to remove Carney. A legal battle erupts. Courts must decide if the president has removal authority. The case reaches the Supreme Court. If the court sides with Trump, Fed independence collapses. If the court sides with Carney, presidential economic authority is constrained permanently. This is the constitutional showdown scenario. Scenario 3. Trump implements tariffs, Carney raises rates, the economy contracts, unemployment rises, inflation rises, stagflation. Both sides blame each other. The 2028 election becomes a referendum on who was right. This is the economic warfare scenario. Let me show you why this has never happened before. In 1951, President Truman wanted the Fed to keep interest rates low to finance the Korean War. The Fed refused. Truman threatened to fire Fed Chair Thomas McCabe. McCabe resigned, but his successor continued the policy of independence. Truman backed down. In 1965, President Johnson pressured Fed Chair William McChesney Martin not to raise rates during the Vietnam War. Martin raised them anyway. Johnson summoned him to his Texas ranch and physically shoved him. Martin held firm. In 1979, President Carter appointed Paul Volcker as Fed Chair. Volcker raised rates to 20% to crush inflation. It caused a recession. Carter lost re-election partly because of that recession, but Carter never tried to fire Volcker. This is the first time a president has explicitly threatened the Fed chair with removal for refusing to accommodate presidential policy. And this is the first time a Fed chair has issued a public ultimatum threatening to sabotage presidential policy. What I know for certain right now, at 4:17 p.m., the Fed chair threatened the president. At 4:34 p.m., the president retreated. The tariffs are postponed. The Fed won this round. But the underlying question remains, can the president control economic policy, or does the Fed have veto power over any policy that affects inflation? The Federal Reserve Act gives the Fed independence to pursue price stability. But the Constitution gives the president authority over trade policy. Those two powers are now in direct conflict. The Fed believes it can nullify presidential trade decisions by adjusting monetary policy. The president believes the Fed must accommodate his economic agenda. This is separation of powers at maximum tension. The Fed is not elected. The president is. But the Fed controls interest rates, which affect every economic decision in the country. When those two powers clash, who wins? Today, the Fed won. But the question is whether this becomes the precedent that constrains all future presidents, or whether this president will find another way to assert authority over the central bank. The next weeks will reveal whether Trump accepts this defeat or whether he escalates by attempting to remove Carney, by appointing governors who will vote against rate increases, or by seeking legislation to constrain Fed independence. Stay with this channel. Turn on notifications. When the next phase of this conflict emerges, you will see the analysis here immediately. This is not over. This is the Fed and the presidency in open warfare over who controls the American economy. What is certain is that the relationship between the presidency and the Federal Reserve will never be the same. Every future president will know that the Fed chair can threaten to crash the economy if the president pursues policies the Fed opposes. Every future Fed chair will know that public confrontation with the president is possible and that institutional power can force presidential retreat. The constitutional crisis of March 2026 ended with the Fed exercising power that constrains the presidency. Whether that power holds depends on whether this president accepts that constraint or whether he decides that breaking the Fed's independence is worth the institutional cost.